It has become extremely popular for businesses to start a podcast, but the honest truth, most don't actually know if it's working. They have no idea. And so then most of them end up quitting. So if you are a business and you have started a podcast or you're wanting to, how do you know you're on the right track? Are you making money? Are you bringing in an ROI? Is the right audience listening? Is this thought leadership thing actually working? The answers to those questions are found, in my opinion, by having the proper strategy, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today. This is Profitcast. I'm Seth Silvers.
And I'm the real Brian. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. This is the show that helps businesses start a podcast that actually makes sense for their business. And I'm excited. We're kicking this hard. We're moving hard on this one. I'm using the word hard way too much, so we're gonna keep going. But I mean, that's it. No, this is tough stuff. We got to keep working. We got to rock this. So anyway, totally. Seth, I'm excited today though to go over this roadmap. And it was so funny because in the last episode, I was talking about how a lot of businesses, a lot of people and creators and advisors, are like, oh, we've got this roadmap, and then it's this one size fits all, and then, it doesn't work for everybody. And you're like, yeah, you're totally trashing the roadmap, which I loved, by the way. But the reality is that there are roadmaps that work, and we want to make sure that this works for as many of you as possible, even though each and every one of us is different. Our businesses are different. Our personalities are different. There's a lot of factors that go into this. But I'm excited to jump right in and go through your roadmap. You've got your ideas. I might play a little devil's advocate here just to kind of make sure that we can represent most sides and find some really good solutions. So I'm excited.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. And just kind of giving an overview, just so you know what to expect on this podcast episode, we're going to give an overview of kind of this, what I call the business podcast roadmap. And then we're going to come back and go more specifically into each of these.
Yes.
If you are wanting more info, like we have way more info on this at thebusinesspodcastroadmap.com. That's where all of this is free. Also, like this is what, when I get hired to do consulting or when we get a new client that we're starting their show, this is what we're walking them through. So this isn't this isn't half of it. This isn't a little bit of it. Like this is the process that we work with companies to do. And I don't say that to say, hey, hire me to do it. I'd say this is actually what we do. And this really came from looking at some of the shows that we've worked on and realizing some work, some don't. What's similar amongst the ones that work, what's similar amongst the ones that don't. And so it's taken a couple years of iteration. This is not a one size fits all thing, but I think that from my experience, the shows that I see that are successful, they have these elements to them. The elements look a little bit different, but these are kind of the elements. So the overview piece is where you kind of walk through this chronological piece where you start off by defining your audience. We then need to identify the pain that audience has. What problems do they have? What questions are they asking? What dreams do they have? What's causing them to like seek something out? Third, you want to create compelling content, which is just reverse engineering the solutions to that pain. And again, we'll come back to this. The fourth piece is having a clear offer. That does not mean selling something for $97. That just means having clarity on what do you want your audience to do next. So these four things are kind of like the first piece of the roadmap. And these are things that if you haven't started a show, like this is where you want to, this is like the pre-launch stuff. If you started your show and you're like, I don't know what those things are, then that's fine. It's never too late to like go in and fix those. But it's kind of this like, here's the foundation of your show is having clarity on your audience, their pain, your content, and the offer. And then once the show is launched, then we transition into optimizing the show, analyzing the results, and then repeating that process. So once your show's launched, then it's kind of this cycle where you're optimizing, analyzing, repeat, optimize, analyze, repeat. You're not just publishing the show and then a year later being like, hey, did that work? Which a lot of people do. So those are kind of the 7 steps of like audience, pain, content, offer, optimize, analyze, repeat. I know for those of you that are listening, that's a lot, but we're going to go through these kind of more specifically, and this will be language that we kind of come back to often.
So with repeat, do you if it's not working, analyze, optimize, analyze, then would it be pivot if it didn't work?
Yeah, it's kind of this like repeat pivot. It's this process of actually looking and asking the question of, is this working? And then you figure out what's working and what's not. You pull some different levers, and then you repeat that process. Then you say, is this working? Then 3 months later, is this working?
Love it.
So it's really this like repeating of the like critical and analytical process of the show.
Sure. And I liked when too, you were talking about identifying pain and stuff, and you mentioned identify pain or problems or struggles or dreams. And I like to say desires too, because how many companies are actually providing what I would consider to be more of a either entertainment or it's not like a life-saving sort of thing. So there could be a legitimate pain. Hey, I need to solve this issue, this problem. That's what we're here for. But other times it could just be like, we're just bettering people's lives through encouragement or entertainment or whatever the case. So that's a lot of identifying desires too. So anyway, just throwing that one in there because I've worked with companies that do both.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think in the business world we often say like, oh, it's got to be like find their pain and exploit their. It's not. It's not that. It's more of like, what questions are they asking? And so for me, exactly. Going back, and maybe we changed it to needs. I don't know. We all Either of these words have like worked through different thing, worked through different terminology, but all of this really starts with this first piece of defining your audience.
Yep.
This is the first thing that when I'm talking with shows that are already established, but they've like flatlined or they're shrinking, I think it's usually an audience problem. Usually the show is too broad. And so the practice that I like to walk people through is to imagine, and Brian, you and I can imagine too, like if we do this show for the next year and we log into our analytics platforms and we see that one person is listening, but they listen every week. It's podcasting. So it's like, I don't know who that is. I don't know that. We don't know their name. We don't know their email address. We don't know that. We just see one. And then a year from now, that person calls us and they're like, hey, I know I haven't met you, but I've listened to everything. I followed all the steps, bought the products, did the things, did the journal prompt, whatever things we mentioned in the last year. They're like, hey, I did it all and it totally changed everything, changed my life completely. I want our content to where that moment makes all of the last year worth it.
Yeah.
If it only makes that impact with one person. So the point that in doing that practice is we should be creating content for one person. When we have talked about the avatar for this show, it really is a established and growing business that knows they should be in podcasting, but they want to do it right and they don't really know where to start.
Yeah.
And so they're starting to ask these questions. Like that's who we're thinking about with this. There's other people that will benefit from this show and different things, but once you're creating content for that one person, you're going to realize there's actually 10,000, there's 100,000, there's probably 1 million people like that one person. And I like to kind of equate this to being on a stage where like if I'm speaking on stage in front of 100,000 people and I don't know who those 100,000 people are, they're just like a random group of people, I'm going to speak a lot differently about podcasting than I am if you put me in a room of 20 people that are all professional podcasters. And this, I didn't speak in front of 100,000 people, but even a couple of weeks ago at a podcasting conference, I had 2 sessions in one day. One was 20 professionals. So they were either CEOs of leading podcasts like hosting companies, or they were professional podcasters.
Mm-hmm.
So that room was 20. And then the other room was, it was about 200, and they were mostly like starting their podcast. It was a variety of anybody and everybody in podcasting. I spoke to them in different ways. I used different words. To the pros, I used a lot more, like I showed a lot more like analytics and different things because I knew they would understand it and have more context. So it's kind of this thing of a lot of people don't know who they're speaking to. And so they end up speaking too broad, and people never recommend broad content.
Yeah.
We never like talk to somebody. We're like, hey, did you listen to this podcast the other day? It was totally mediocre. Like that's not how it works.
Usually you're like, that sucked, bro. Or that was awesome. You're the media. What did somebody say once too is you want to make sure that you're evoking an emotion. If it's happiness or excitement or whatever, even if it's anger, like they're pissed off at you, you're evoking an emotion. But if it's apathy that you're creating, that's the worst possible thing. So like that mediocre apathy is make them happy or piss them off, one way or the other. Go at it.
Yeah. So I think that audience is like, this is probably the most common thing that I see that is a big mistake is people want to start. They know podcasts can be consumed around the world, and so they want to make it for everybody in the world. And so that's why with this roadmap, it all starts with kind of this question of who is your one person.
Let me bring something up here because this is me talking as a multi-passionate, and I'm a multi-passionate entrepreneur. I know a lot of multi-passionate entrepreneurs.
Mhm.
Every one of us struggle. Every one of us. Because the world is designed to pick one thing and roll with it, niche down, and that's what you do. But for those of us, and I'm not talking about like ADHD, you can't commit, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about those of us who have a lot of interests and desires. We can commit, we can persevere, we can see it through, but there's just so many wonderful things out there that you want to experience and do. So, I mean, and we're not going to be able to answer that. In fact, I would love to do an entire episode on how a multi-passionate business and entrepreneur / podcast can actually somehow succeed. But the reality is that there's a lot of times where somebody will say they don't want to reach everybody, but they do want to reach a specific group of people.
Mhm.
So for example, let's say our business does a lot of things. In fact, I love Shark Tank, right? You'll hear the shark saying your business is too niche. It's not investable. They like to invest in larger things. So there are businesses out there that do a lot of things. They have a larger gamut of information and products and services and other things. Can a podcast like that work? Because their audience is broader. So can something like that work for a business that is more multifaceted? And for those, again, entrepreneurs and businesses who want to talk about more than just one little tiny thing, knowing that their audience likes that too. So, and this is not necessarily something that has to be answered today, but that is something I want to explore and recognize that it is a reality. It's just how do we figure that out?
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. I think a lot of it comes back to what you want and what our expectations are. And again, the big point here is not necessarily a one size fits all approach to your audience. It's defining your audience. Your audience might be different than mine. Your
Yeah.
audience
Yeah.
might be broad. Your audience might be like your one person might be a mom at home with young kids. That's incredibly broad. But if you're wanting, like, you have to define that. And if you're going after that strategy, then you're probably going after a volume game. Like, you probably need
Yeah.
more people. And so that's the thing where in podcasting, the broader your audience is, typically the more people that you need to be listening to your show in order for your show to like make economic sense and initially be profitable.
Yeah.
So it just depends. I was talking with somebody, a good friend of mine the other day, and him and I have had so many conversations over the years um, about this topic because he is pretty well known in 3 different areas of business.
Hmm.
They're kind of connected, but not really. It's podcasting, branding, and AI. And he's pretty well known in all of them.
It's pretty broad.
And
Yeah.
all the time, he's having people saying like, focus, focus, focus. Like just pick one, like just pick one and go. And his business is doing well, but
Yeah.
it's not like incredible. Like it's been growing year over year, but like he wants to see it grow. And I had given him the same advice many times. And then him and I were sitting down one time and I was like, I was like, tell me if you're wrong or tell me if I'm wrong. But if your 2 options were you having like a $10 million a year business and only doing one thing, or having a $1 million a year business, but getting to do like a handful of things, which one makes you happier? And he was like, it's the one where I get to do multiple things. And so I think a lot of people are like that, where then it's just the expectations. You're right. Our society is designed to reward focus. And I think that if people are wanting to like build a business or build a podcast and go really, really deep and probably go faster, then it's probably going to be talking about less things in a deeper way to a specific audience. But on the flip side, I think there's a lot of people that they're like, I enjoy talking about multiple things or being more multidisciplinary. And I think you just have to match your expectations with that.
And I think there's ways to do it. It's just a matter of finding, and again, these are the things that I know we want to explore, because this is something I'd like to answer personally, is how do multifaceted, podcasts and businesses thrive when, like you said, our society is not geared towards that, even though it was like back in the Renaissance, it's like the Renaissance man was like prized back then. It was revered, and now it's not. And so it's just the way the society has changed. It's not wrong or right. It's just the way it is. How do you still thrive? I think the biggest thing too that I like to say is to not, we talk about authenticity, right? So when you're defining your audience, you've got to be able to relate to them. And if you're not going forth with who you are, like your friend you're talking about, if he picked one of those things, if he said, okay, fine, I'm just going to do AI and I'm not going to do podcasting and branding, is he going to really be truly happy and authentic and be able to really put forth a, some kind of content with a business, is he really going to hit 10 million? Is his audience actually going to be like, oh yeah, this guy's totally legit? Are they going to be like, something off about him? He's holding back. Something's wrong. You see what I'm saying? Is like, he might not be able to be the true aspect of the business that he's trying to create if he's going against what it's supposed to be or who he is or whatever. I mean, of course, as an entrepreneur, a solo business owner, you are your business essentially. If you've got a multi-billion or a multi-million-dollar business, you've got multiple people involved, and it's a little different in that sense. But I do think it's important to consider those things too.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, this is why it's so important that you have clarity on what you want, and you have clarity on what the journey is that you want, which is extremely hard to get. I say that like it's like, oh, just have clarity. I know it's challenging, but I think again, this is define your audience. I want to move forward, and so the next piece that really is very connected to this after you define your audience is knowing what their pain or their problems are or their needs are. And so if you're wondering this, it's probably like, hey, what are the main questions that your audience has? What are the frustrations that they have? I think also it's identifying what dreams do they have, or like where are they wanting to go in relation to the content that you're talking about. Martin Luther King Jr. did this so beautifully in his I Have a Dream speech, where the whole speech, he was actually juxtaposing the language from where he dreams America should be to where it is currently. I don't remember all the exact words, but it's like, I have a dream that, this, and this will happen instead of this reality that we're currently living in. I think it's really important that you know what that gap is.
Yeah.
And ideally, your podcast kind of fits in that gap. And I think that's where we see a really, really good show is when the purpose of your show is you are helping your audience. You're not the hero, you're the guide. You're helping your audience move closer towards the dreams that they have by solving their problems. You're just helping them solve their problems.
Love it.
I think that's it. And I'll kind of tie this in with the next one, which is the compelling content.
I was just going to ask one question.
Yeah.
How do you identify pain before you have an audience? You're getting out there, and I mean, granted, if you're a business, you've got customers. I'm sure you're getting that information, but for those that are getting started and figuring this out, how are you able to find that information out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it sounds simple, but I think you ask. I think you talk to people that are in your potential target audience, and this is why doing research before you launch a show can be really, really helpful. In finding a good idea. For a lot of people, they're actually creating content for themselves where they currently are or where they used to be. So I have a feeling that a lot of creators are going to have a good idea of where they should be or like what those problems are just anecdotally from their own story. But you probably know people in your life that are in that season. And so asking them, hey, what questions do you have? What's frustrating you about X, Y, and Z? And you're probably going to get 10, 20 answers if you talk to different people. And guess what? There's your content strategy. Your content strategy is just reverse engineering the solutions to your audience's problems.
Love it.
So
that's great.
Yeah,
cool.
That's kind of the first three: audience, pain, content. And then this fourth piece of the roadmap is to have a clear offer.
Yes.
And again, this is not, hey, what are you selling? This is, where do you want your audience to go? If your audience, there will always be a portion of your audience that says, we want more. And do you have a clear next step really to get them off of the podcast? And again, we're mostly speaking to businesses or brands that are launching. And so you do want them to have a clear next step, or you want to match your expectations. If you don't have an offer, then you want to recognize that this is purely a brand play and it's probably going to be hard to track. For us on this show, like as an example, you'll hear us at the end of each show talking about the website, thebusinesspodcastroadmap.com. Like we want any listeners to the show to go there. That's where we're going to be collecting our resources. That's where we're going to be, updating new things that we're learning. And so like, that's where we want them to go. It's totally free. Just head to the website. And so it might not be a $97 course or a $10,000 consulting, but it's clear. We want everybody that's listening to this show to know to go to the Business Podcast Roadmap. And I think a lot of people, their offer isn't valuable. They're just like, sign up for my newsletter. It's like, I don't want another newsletter. Like, I hear that all the time. People are like, oh yeah, we're just going to mention our newsletter on our podcast. It's like, do you, and I always ask them, I said, do you want to sign up to another newsletter? And they're like, no, I don't.
No, not really. Yeah. My inbox. I like what you're saying though, with the MLK thing is, here's where I would like the world to go. It reminds me of what Gene Roddenberry did, as a cop for 12 years or whatever. And he tried to better society and better humanity, and he kept failing. And that's why he created Star Trek. He wanted to show this is where I want the world to go. So I like that this is where we want our listeners and our viewers to go. That's our passion behind it. That whether it's an actual monetized offer or not, I like that it's an offer of growth. It's an offer of, we're inviting you to the journey or whatever that is.
Yeah.
I like
that.
that.
I mean, for us, like there's a lot of businesses that start shows and then stop them because they don't know if it's working.
Yeah.
So we want this show, and we want our resources to be, we want people to be able to say, oh, those resources helped me to continue on with my show. That's the goal.
Yeah. And to understand too, the value that you're bringing that you may not have expected to. And that's a good thing. There's all kinds of, I'm excited to go into that later too. All right. The last. So those are the first 4 right there.
Those are the first 4. So ideally you have clarity on those 4 things before you launch your show. Again, I say ideally. If you are listening, which I imagine a lot of our listeners actually already have a show, and that's fine too, because these are things that like you can kind of like it doesn't even have to be a public relaunch, but you can step back and say, okay, let's gain clarity on these things. But everybody should have clarity on these things. We put them together in what we call a podcast brief, which is kind of a like 1-page business plan. And I think everybody should have some kind of like document that's like, this is my show's identity. And that's what you're filtering your content. That's what you're filtering things through. So that you're saying, does this idea fit with this identity? And then from there, like, is kind of these post-production things. This is where it's this cycle of optimize, analyze, repeat. The first one is optimize. This is initially making sure that like you have all of your data. So like we'll have many episodes on this in the future, but I recommend pulling data off of all of the platforms like hosting platforms or Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and actually putting them into your own spreadsheets. So you're optimizing and making sure that you have your data. You're making sure that your show is optimized for all of the platforms. So like if you're publishing on Spotify, you're using new features that they're using, or, if you're optimizing to your best extent with YouTube, you're kind of making sure, okay, we are hitting the buttons we're supposed to be hitting on the platforms that we want to be growing on. And then you start analyzing. Then that's when you actually have that data rolling in, and you start asking yourself, what's working, what's not working, what are the benchmarks that we want to be hitting, and then you make adjustments there, and then you just repeat that process. It's constantly like, okay, we're optimizing for the platforms, we're optimizing for our audience, then we're measuring what's actually working. Like you might realize our audience is dropping off after 2 minutes into our episodes. Okay, we maybe need to change what happens 2 minutes into our episodes. And then 3 months later, you look and say, did that change make a difference? Did it work? So it kind of becomes this like process. I mentioned all 3 of those together, and then we can kind of go more specifically into them. But it's really this process of analyze, optimize, repeat. A lot of shows, they just publish and then they don't really come back to ask those questions. They just like kind of blame their audience or blame their podcast agency for it like not growing, when they're like, I've been doing the same thing for 52 weeks and it didn't grow. And it's like, well, if the same thing sucked, then no duh.
And you got to wonder too, and this would be something that I'd be very curious to know what, I don't know if this is a percentage thing, but is the entire show bad, or is it a section of the show? Because I think a lot of times people keep going back to the drawing board and trying new things. I'm guilty of this too. I've done this a lot. It's like, oh, the entire show just must be terrible. Let's start over.
Yeah.
And the reality is
it's a
it's
show in front of the wrong audience.
True. Yeah. So I feel like there's a lot of little fine tuning things that you probably should try first, rather than scrapping the whole thing or saying, we didn't get it, we just going to quit the show. And you're like, no, you had something fantastic. Was it perfect? No. Did it work? Not quite. But could it? Yes. And there's little tweaks. And I would be curious to know how much of that is the majority of the problem versus the show just entirely being bad.
Yeah.
That's
cool. And I think the benefit comes from asking the questions. Like, I don't have a percentage because this is a made up number, but it's like probably half of the benefit of going through all of this is taking the time to actually sit down and dedicate space in your brain to asking, how can I improve the show?
Yeah.
How can I get the show better?
Yeah, I love
Most people do not take the time to do that. Most people don't listen back to their show. Look at their show once they're done editing, they send it off to some editor and then it's done. and then they're like trusting, like, okay, cool, hopefully the editor does some magical thing that causes my podcast to go viral.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like most people just aren't taking time to pause and say, is this working? And if it's not working, then let's use some of the data that we have at our disposal to identify maybe where things are not working. And then what can we change to maybe improve that? And if you can repeat that process, then you're probably going to have a show that continues to get better and better, which is becoming a lot more important because the market is getting more competitive. I don't think it's going to be as easy to succeed in the next 3 years as it was in the last 3 years. And any podcaster will tell you the last 3 years was harder than the 3 years before it. And it's just because things are getting more competitive. The stakes are higher.
That's very true. And, we were talking about marketers ruin everything, recently. And it's like, in many ways, marketers ruined podcasting. Marketers ruined social media. And it's true. But the reality is we got to live with it and we got to move forward. And prior to marketing kind of taking over podcasting was relatively easy and simple to get started and get noticed and put out great content. And then it became a game. So we have to play the game, but we got to figure out how to also be real and make it valuable too. So I appreciate this. Well, thank you, Seth. I appreciate this. I'm looking forward to diving more into the roadmap as we continue forward. We're going to do, episodes that will dive into audience only and, kind of moving forward. So, but how do we get the roadmap?
Yeah. So if you go to the businesspodcastroadmap.com, then it's free. So yeah, just go to businesspodcastroadmap.com. We'll have the link in the show notes as well. Our vision behind this is simply that it's just one of the best resources out there for businesses wanting to start a podcast. We're going to update it every single month. So we're going to be adding new resources, new pages. We're going to be collaborating with industry partners and friends on different topics. So it's not just going to be like Seth's thoughts. It's going to be Seth and Brian's thoughts. We bring in a lot of other friends that we have from the industry to really like talk about this. The vision behind it is that almost every question that you would have about a podcast is answered there with directions on how you can actually implement it.
I love it.
And if you want to hire us to help, then that's cool. But also if you decide to just do everything that we mentioned in the roadmap over the next year, then that is awesome too. That's why we're doing this.
That's the beauty of it, is that if you're a DIY kind of business or person or whatever, and you just want to figure this out and do it on your own, go for it. We're going to give it all away. We're not going to do the whole like, hey, we'll give you a little bit, but then come buy our product to learn more. We're just going to be like, hey, here it is. But we also recognize that it's a time thing. It's a resource thing. It's a lot of work. And so if you do want to get in touch with us directly, head on over to, we've got our stuff. We've got information on our businesses, Real Brian Media and Seth's business Story On. It's all in the links in the podcast app. You can just scroll down for that. Also on YouTube in the description, you can get all that information. So by the way, if you just also want to contact us and ask us a question, if you're just like, hey, I've got a question for the show, I'd love for this to be an episode, then let us know and we will absolutely consider it. We'd love to hear from you either way. So all the links are in the show notes, and thank you again for joining us. It's been fun. We've got a lot more coming. So we'll just sign off for this time and we'll see you in the next episode. Love it.